Hi, students. So I have reviewed the homework that you turned in on Wednesday's class, and I have a few things that I want to go over to make sure that you are on the right page when you turn in homework for Friday, which will, of course, be going into your final CGA paper. So I have these four things that I want to go over. First, I also want to mention that we have uploaded, or Calvin has uploaded, text files in all of your folders. So you see text for your articles, and then below that PDFs for these. So let's go back here. All right, so samples of the kind of graphs you should include. So there was some confusion with some of you on what you should have done for today. And so I was looking for examples of graphs that are like those that we found in the sample paper. So something like a graph on lexical density scores, which you can get by taking those text files, and I apologize that they weren't up there before, I thought they were, that you can get by taking those text files and running them through one of the tools that is listed on the assignment sheet. You could also just do a Google search for text analysis tools to find some others. You should definitely be sure to record in the method section what tool you used for different calculations. The methods section in this paper is going to work very closely with the results, so that the methods section should really answer any questions that we have. So, for instance here, you might have a question. It would be reasonable to say, what is lexical density? Now, on this, I would expect the caption to tell me a little bit of something about lexical density, and especially what the range is and what a high score means versus a low score. That's what I would expect in the caption. But if I had additional questions where I was like, I want a little more information, then I would go to the methods section. I'm going to just come up here to the methods. And here is a subheading for lexical density test. Ideally, these subheadings, and we'll talk about document design a little bit more in class, I would like to see it maybe bolded and italicized, or something to separate it even more visually from the body of the text. But you can see this text calculates the number of functional content words. For instance, in the sentence, it ate very fast, the words ate, very, and fast, it's a little bit off your screen here, contain content, so the lexical density scores would be 3 out of 5. So some sort of explanation of this. I would also expect which, if it wasn't already specified earlier in the methods, which tool was used to calculate these lexical density scores. Note also, here's words per minute. And so it explains how it was calculated with an online calculator. And again, if I go down here to words per minute, we can see a breakdown of this. Okay, this caption tells me the story, but I would definitely expect something that says words per minute, the typical and traditional newscasts. Also, I'll just remind you guys, we don't want to include these big captions or these big titles. That's what they are up here, just the caption. So I'm going to switch now and just show you some quick examples of some of what your classmates turned in, since we didn't have a chance to peer review today. If your graphs are up on here, this means that you did the assignment right, that you're in the right ballpark. And in addition, you probably, from watching this video, get a little bit extra critique, a little bit extra help on how you could revise these to be even more effective. So here's one for lexical density. This one shows the number of words in both public and scholarly articles. Here, another table, this time on lexical density, table graph on sentence length. Here's another one. Most people did sentence length, lexical density, or the gunning fog index. Again, if you include this, I want to know what it goes up to and what the low score means and what a high score means. So having that kind of clarification will be very helpful. I would also, for a graph like this, I would completely expect that there would be a section in your method section that would allow a reader to really quickly skim up and find out more information about what the gunning fog index is. Find out more information about that kind of measurement. Now, a question that several of you had in class today is whether you should include a breakdown by individual article type. So this is each one of the 3 articles, or if you should combine them all together like this. So this graph here, figure 1, is the same number of average words per sentence, but it has all 3 articles combined. This breaks it out. I'm not going to tell you which one is right. It depends on your purpose, and it depends on the story you want to tell. So if you just want to talk about the overall difference among them, this is probably the better visualization. If, however, you want to compare individual ones, and there's some reason to compare this one and this one and this one and that one, you want to break out what the individual parts are, then something like this might be more effective. So as you start writing up the results today, you will probably see, how do you want to talk about it? What visualization makes the most sense? Might also be easier if you write down your hypotheses now. It's okay if you kind of didn't start off with them, but try to, as much as possible, before going in and doing these calculations. And I think just about everybody will have a calculation like one of these. Before you do these, think about what are you expecting? What do you think will be the differences and why? And then you can use your results section to say, was the hypothesis supported or is it not supported? In research, often when hypotheses are not supported, that tends to be very interesting. It's kind of like why. It's when we sort of change our view of knowledge. In the science, a lot of times when a hypothesis is not supported, like you think it should work this way, this is how it should be, and it doesn't work that way. That's like, oh, we have to change our theory. We have to change how we're thinking about the world, or we have to figure out why it's not doing that. And so I want you in this small assignment here to have a little bit of that experience. See if your hypotheses are upheld or not upheld, and how that might change what your sort of stereotypes are about different kinds of writing or different types of disciplines. Now I'm going to talk about this example. This overall is a very nice, clean graph, very easy to understand. And it is labeled correctly. One thing that I will point out, though, is it starts the axis at 10, which has the benefit of really showing these differences, but has the disadvantage that some people could question the credibility. Normally, we expect bar graphs to start at the bottom of the scale, which would be 0. Or you can make a case that you can't have a 0-word sentence, but so 1 would be the lowest possible that a sentence could go. Here's another of the graphs that I pulled out from homework submissions that is looking pretty good. Very clean, easy to interpret. The only thing I would change here would just be the caption. We don't need the complete sentence. We can just say average, and actually you can just say average words because number of is clear. This you need at a minimum. Words per sentence is pretty clear. I don't think I need any more explanation of that. you could optionally include another sentence explaining what it shows. The big decision to make here is whether you want to break it down into all three of these, or if you wanted to have just one average, which would be somewhere around 17.5 or 17.3, and whether you want one average for all three of these. So it's a little bit different emphasis on the same story. Here's another example looking at lexical density, and the caption's pretty good. It's telling me what's in here. It gives a little definition of lexical density. Again, I would expect in the methods section when you guys get to writing that, and you might want to go ahead and start writing it now as you're doing the results. I would expect, though, to see a bigger definition of lexical density and how it was calculated. Now, one thing that you will notice is this right here on a scale that goes from 0 to 100, this difference is not very big. So I would, and then the fact that there's kind of wide variation in here suggests to me that there is not very much difference. So sometimes you're going to need to make a decision about whether to emphasize the difference or to emphasize the sameness. In this case, I would suspect that they're pretty similar in terms of lexical density. And that makes sense since they're both academic articles. By contrast, in this one right here, where we have the public and the scholarly, that's a big difference. We're averaging about 17 here and maybe 28 up here. So that's a big difference between public and scholarly. Here, I would say very little difference in terms of lexical density. So that's a decision I would also like you guys to think about. Also, in terms of the table, I do like to have a kind of guideline under here to separate the header row. Again, you also have to think about, does it make sense to break it down by individual article or just report the average? The fact that this writer has put this on a table rather than a graph suggests to me that this is a smaller, less interesting story. Otherwise, it would be in a graph. Tables take up less room. We usually reserve them for stories that are not as interesting. In this case, because they're so similar, I would kind of emphasize the lack of interesting. So I think a table is very appropriate to it. If I were going to talk about this wide range, that's kind of a big difference. This one kind of stands out as being lower than the other educational psychology ones. So if I were going to talk about this particular article, then I would break it down in the table. If I'm not going to talk about it, then I would just report the average here. One last recommendation when we're looking at graphs, use consistent numbers of decimal places, so I would make that 11.0 if possible. And for sure, I would definitely include what gutting fog index, what the range is, and what a score of 0 would mean, and I think it goes up to 20, and what a score of 20 means. Does 20 mean more complicated or less complicated? Okay, so now you guys have seen a couple samples. Make sure that for Friday, you bring in a complete results section. You might want to also start working on the method section. You're going to have to write it eventually anyway. And it might be easier to just do it alongside the results section. Gone over a few techniques here. Now this method section is also, as you are talking about your original variable, you're going to have to talk about all the decisions you made for this original variable in the method section. Now, let me give you guys some ideas that you could think about for this original variable. And one thing might be to think about some of the language strategies that we've talked about in class so far. Now, when you're deciding on what would make a good original variable, think, what's a hypothesis you have about how these two sets of articles, these two corpora of articles might be different? And if you think that there might be a difference, or you're kind of curious, or you can make a hypothesis, go ahead. That's probably a good original variable. So one thing that you might want to think about using could be some measures of how confidently writers talk about their results. So this is from chapter 9, where we have this list of verbs that writers use to indicate how confident they are. And words like proofs. So you could take this list here and maybe just focus on the ones that are more tentative. And are some disciplines more tentative? And are other disciplines more confident when stating their claims? Are some types of public articles more tentative than scholarly articles, or is it the opposite? So you could use some of these types of verbs to indicate that. Let me go ahead and remind you how to do a search. So if you wanted to look up a particular word in a set, you can go to Edit, Advanced Search, and you would look up a particular folder where you would contain these articles. So here I have my cell phone medicine, and let's look for seams and see how often that appears in there. Not very often, though it's used the way we might predict. So you could look up how common are particular of these types of words, this type of language in these different kinds of articles. Or you can look through other parts of this chapter or other chapters that we've read and see, I wonder if there is a difference between public and scholarly articles, or if there is a difference between art history and engineering in the use of certain kinds of words or certain types of language. Something else that you might consider looking at is on the day that you turned in the nurse's gloves assignment, we talked about using subordinators, in particular these particular subordinators, to show concession. And you might see, are there some groups of articles that do more concessions? They spend more time talking about flaws or shortcomings of the research than other groups. And so make a hypothesis, see if that ends up being upheld. We also, of course, went over today active versus passive voice in class. And one thing that you could do is count sentences that use these different types, active sentences versus passive sentences, and see, does a particular discipline or a particular type of article use passive more often than others. Now, since this would be hard to do with the word search, what you might want to do is isolate a particular section. Maybe look at the abstracts of all of your articles and see how often per sentence, what proportion, what percentage of sentences are in passive voice and what percentage are in active voice. Or you can pick a different section, the discussion section or the introduction. And so just do a more detailed analysis like that, especially if you have to count by hand, if you have to do something manually, just do it for a particular section of the articles. If you do that, you need to explain that carefully in the methods section. And it should also be clear from the caption of any visuals that you include with that. If you wanted to include a little bit more on passive voice or look up, you could take a look at this article right here where she looked at the use of passive voice in student and professional writing and found that students use passive voice more than professionals did. And this is the other article we looked up in class that you could also use as an example for different kinds of original variables that you can include. So for class on Friday, I am expecting you to have thought about some original variables and go ahead and brainstorm some things that might be different across these. Now, your assignment instructions. So your assignment instructions have these following requirements. It says state 2 hypotheses. Actually, you can consider that as state at least 2. So if you have 3, that's fine. And at least 3 major stories. You might have multiple visualizations speaking to the same hypothesis. So for instance, if you were going to say that scholarly articles are more complex, use more complex language and sentence structures than public articles, then you could have a couple different visualizations. One maybe looking at the Gunning-Fogg readability index, another looking at sentence length, and another looking at lexical density. All of those are different ways of measuring sentence complexity and language complexity, and they would all speak to one hypothesis. So you can have multiple visualizations that discuss one particular hypothesis. We are going to talk in class on Friday about really kind of making connections to the discourse community. That means the people who read, the types of people who read this type of article. So if it's public versus scholarly, you can talk about who reads these, what are their expectations, why do they read, how does the language, how does the writing reflect what those readers are looking for, what they value. Likewise, if you're doing, say, art history versus engineering, what are those readers looking for, and how does the writing change? How does the way they present information change based on that? Same thing for medicine versus education. What conclusions can we draw about those different types of readers and what they expect? Here are some various examples here. If you do something like emotional words, I would expect your method section to define what you mean by emotional words. Maybe give a list of specific words that you're looking for that suggest emotion. And finally, I want to direct your attention to the evaluation criteria. And that 30% is on originality and depth. So we want to see an interesting kind of point of analysis, something interesting, unexpected, or insightful about what you find in the differences among these articles, or the connections, the conclusions that maybe you can make about the people who read them, the discourse community or community of readers that use these different genres.